Do you want to
We don't
start?
have a chair.
Well, Vice Chair Srinivasan will serve as our chair.
I am the chair, so you are the chair today.
Yep, did we want to start?
Yeah, let's go ahead and start at least.
You want to start, note that we're starting without a quorum, and we're moving the agenda items. So how about we do that?
Good afternoon, everybody. Today is November 25th. It is 3:02 p.m. We are starting the Finance and Administration Committee meeting. We will note that currently we do not have a quorum present, but we will go ahead and start this meeting and move on to any action items once a quorum has been met. I will begin with roll call. Vice Chair Srinivasan.
Present.
Director Showalter.
Here.
Thank you, and I'll note that currently Director Scozola is absent and our Chair, Wei. Okay, since we will not be addressing any action items at this time, we will move on to item number 3, which is establish the Affordable Clean Community Fund. And our staff speaking today will be Zoe Elizabeth, our Deputy Director of Decarbonization Programs and Policy.
How about the budget update? Are we even?
It's an action item.
It's an action item. This is also action item, but do we
This
have
is a discussion.
Oh, this is a discussion. Sorry, I didn't notice.
We went through these slides with the executive committee. I'll go fairly quickly. It is a discussion item, so I've got a few places where I will pause. But I'll just kind of start by saying it would have been teed up by Amrit's budget discussion. So do you want to say a couple words maybe just to set the stage for this?
Yeah, so hopefully you've reviewed the budget materials.
There is some surplus there.
So we're getting at a good financial position, and it affords us an opportunity to start looking at funding areas that are mission aligned, but that will later in our priority than meeting our reserve target. Now that we've met our reserve targets, it's an opportunity to consider these longer term strategic areas. We're forecasting for this year we'll be meeting our reserve target. Again, these are all uncertain. But in our future projections shows that we could be in conditions where even in the future we will meet or exceed our reserve target. So to think ahead, we want to say when we do meet our reserve target, how can we take the funds and fund these longer-term strategic priority areas that we now have the opportunity to do. And that's what Zoe's going to go through all of these key strategic areas.
So this is a item that staff's been working on for several months, and Amrit and I are here to talk about it today, but really directors from across the organization have been working to discuss and think as we hit these targets, our reserve targets, and we have excess funds, how can we really plan and grow our overall impact? And so actually we're thinking just this morning, updating even the name of the fund, call it a clean community fund. So this is a discussion item. We plan to bring it also as a discussion item to the board meeting in December to get folks' input on this. There's 4 portions of the discussion. And as I mentioned, I will pause. My plan is I'll kind of pause between after number 2, number 3, and number 4. Okay, Amrit said some of this. But one thing is that we operate at SVCE in always uncertain budget conditions. We've done a really good job, I think, at best I can at managing within this uncertainty and continuing to grow our programs fund, continuing to grow our overarching portfolio. But at the same time, some of our overall mission to reduce dependence on fossil fuels is a long-term, big mission. And we're seeking really strategic direction from the board that will enable us to plan for some of these longer-term initiatives. So longer-term scaled electrification of appliances, ensuring that we have and can guarantee a discount long-term. the ability to invest in local power supply technologies that can help us ensure a long-term clean portfolio, these sorts of things. But everything that you're going to see and that we'll talk about in the next couple slides is based on this mission, right? To provide carbon-free, affordable, and reliable electricity and innovative programs for the SVCE committee. Over the past 7 years, we've been working to build this stability and kind of build our overall capacity, but obviously this is a big mission and a big goal. And so we need some long-term thinking. And why we're coming to the board now, into the Finance and Strategy Committee now, is that we're at this inflection point. So as Amrit mentioned, right, we have this internal inflection, whereas as we are approaching our reserve target levels, we'll have the ability to think more long-term about strategy. But also there's big changes that are happening in the energy market at large. One, as electricity bills have continued to have increased over the last several years, it really underscores the need for SVCE to have consistent discounts. We don't want to over-promise in this portion of our work that we can do everything to solve the affordability challenges with electric bills, right? That's going to be much larger things that have through regulation, but we also want to know that we can do our part with our rates. So we'll talk a bit about that. In addition, as we've talked about a lot, there are new air district rules, first through the Bay Area Quality Management District, and later statewide through the California Air Resources Board, that will begin to phase out the sale of gas appliances, starting as early as 2027. This will exponentially increase the demand for heat pumps in our service territory and the need to create scalable funding to ensure that folks aren't hit with high upfront transition costs. And then finally here, as we've also talked a lot in previous conversations, evolving market conditions are making it more difficult to hit clean targets and really underscore the need for new power supply technologies and local development to ensure we have affordable and reliable clean energy going into the future. Having board direction at this point in our development will ensure that instead of making decisions on an annual basis, depending on what the budget looks like, we have multi-year vision that we can begin to build the internal capacity for and really plan and maximize our impact. We've got 3 priorities of funding that I will go through, but as always is important, the board would always retain authority to shift direction in changing circumstances. So we're looking for some levels of certainty, but that of course doesn't mean that as conditions change, the board could always shift priorities. Okay, so that was the opening on why we're asking for this. I'm going to go through these 3 priorities that we are proposing and the funding targets that we're proposing, and then I'll pause for some discussion. Okay. But the overall goal here is to ensure that the energy transition is something that's accessible and scalable for everyone in our service territory, not just early adopters. So the context here is how we would determine that there was availability of funding. This would always be part of the annual budgeting process. So that we would identify any funds that are above the reserve policy targets. For the purposes of this discussion, we're working with an estimate of $40 million for year 24-25, which is subject to change as there's a lot of uncertainty right now, but it's helpful just to see what this could look like. But then for this year in the mid-year 2025, we will confirm estimates and make a recommendation for the fund. So that's also how this would work on an annual basis, is that the funding above, or the availability of funds above that reserve target would be determined during the budgeting process. And then when there's more certainty within the budget, the funds would actually be the board would actually allocate money to that funds. I think I just want to actually just pause to make sure that, since this was different than when we did it with the board, the budget conversation, just pause to see if there's any clarifying questions on the rationale or kind of how this fund would work within the budget process.
I have a question, but
Well, I'd just be interested in hearing about some examples
Okay.
of programs that would work much better if they were multi-year and they weren't just had money allocated initially that might be held in reserve for that purpose, but
Okay, perfect. That's the next piece.
so my question is, you mentioned that the board said this is a multi-year approach. The funding itself is not multi-year, that is, it depends on the reserve targets and other things, but then the priorities, for example, these three priorities are multi-year priorities.
That's right. So the priorities would be multi-year priorities, and they would be multi-year programs. The funding as you'll see, the targets that we're looking for funding will exceed any 1 year's funding above our reserve targets. But the idea is that when that level of funding is available, as it could be this year with $40 million, it would go into this fund, and that fund would grow over time to be able to fund these three priorities. So I'll talk a little bit more about those details, but the money would be spent over multiple years.
Got it. So the baseline is 40 million this year. Every year it might go up or down depending on the.
40 million is an example. We're not setting aside any funding in the budget this year, but we want to talk about creating this fund. We're seeking your comments and feedback. We think it makes sense to create a multi-year areas, and so years when we have good financial years, especially when we exceed our reserve. And the way we generally want to do this is like at the end of the fiscal year close. When we look at the actual financials, we can say, okay, we can set aside some funds. We would come back to the board, and the board would say, yes, set this money to this ACC fund, for example. So in those years, the fund would go there, and then as Zoe said, it would be directed to these multi-year projects. But each project itself will Zoe and others will seek board approval for.
So where is that? Is that the 40 million is the low bar or any funds above that?
So 40 million is an example, like this year's budget. If you look at the forecast, let's say the forecast were to prevail, then at the end of, let's say, next year or at mid-year when we have more certainty in the budget, we could say, hey board, what do you think about this fund, longer-term strategic fund? Board says, yes, let's create this fund. So we can say, okay, based on our budget and our financials, let's say they were to prevail. For this budget, we're advocating no allocation. But if we were in financial position, we would say, okay, let's direct, for example, this year, we could be in position to say, forecasting, that we could direct 40 million. So we would say, okay, board, let's direct the 40 million now to this fund.
if we don't direct it to this fund, what do we do with it? I mean,
It will sit in our reserve.
okay.
And if you remember the way the reserves work, if we exceed the max level of 500 days of cash on hand, within a year, the next budget, we have to come back with a proposal as to how we want to spend that fund. So rather than making those ad hoc decisions, we want to strategically think ahead of time that if we get to those good financial position, how should we meeting some of these longer dated strategic priority areas? I thought I had a doorbell.
No, I think it was
That
computer.
that could be my ring.
Oh, okay.
Not your ring. But
I was hoping.
Yeah.
so, okay, got it. So that reserve is for just our backup and then maybe
Yes, so-
any uncertainty in the market and those kinds of
We
things.
keep an operating reserve. We say, let's hold, if you remember each budget year, we look at
Cash
we look at
amount.
our risk analysis, we do a stress test, we say, we want to make sure that our reserves are at a level that we can withstand some of these possible risk events. And that's how we set up with 350 days of cash on hand. So we're saying, okay, if we were to meet that target, technically between 350 and 500, we don't have to do anything. But before we get to 500, let's start thinking about allocating funds, longer term strategic priorities.
Once the money goes into this fund, you cannot pull it back.
We can pull it back.
You can pull it
If it's not unspent, you can come back to the board. The board has the flexibility to redirect any funds.
Okay.
So if we were in a financial situation where we needed for that money, we would come back to the board and say, take the money out of this fund.
Sounds good. Yeah.
And then just, so over the years, we have like 5 or 6 years of history now, how much money would we have normally had to put in such a reserve?
Up until now, nothing, because we're just about forecasting this year that we are actually going to be going above our reserve target.
Okay.
So now we've met that. So that's why you kind of see funding our key areas.
By saying this was a trigger.
Yes, that's right.
All right.
That's exactly right,
Think
yeah.
of it as like we have priorities of how we fund. We've got to fund the day-to-day operations. We've got to pay our bills. We've got to do our programs. And then we have to meet our reserve target. And now when we meet our reserve target, what's the next area of priority? That's what we're saying are these strategic areas. That's another way of thinking.
Till now, we had, for example, discount stabilization, it was coming from the other fund, one firm or other.
Yeah, the main operating reserve, 350 days, we target it to keep a 1% discount. So that if we were in a plausible risk event, if that were to happen, we are in a position to at least provide our customers with a 1% discount. This basically says, let's set aside so that we are on a forward 3-year basis, at least we can provide a consistent equivalent to 5% discount, which is 4% to everyone and 1% directed to low income customer, which is the level of discount we've been providing recently.
Thank you.
Thank you for asking, to make sure we're level setting. So again, so now as we're reaching those clear reserve targets with these additional funds, how can we direct them towards some of our longer term strategic initiatives? So there's 3 that staff has identified as key to ensuring the clean energy transition is really accessible for all SVCE customers. The first is discount stabilization. We have been able to continually offer a discount, but we want to ensure that even in bad years, we're able to offer that. It's particularly important as conditions continue to change. The second is scalable support for pollution-free appliances. So I mentioned that regulations are changing. Right now, to give an example, we provide rebates for about 700 heat pump water heaters per year in our programs, and we have budgeted that for the next 3 years. When air district rules go into effect, we estimate that there could be a need for about 10,000 new heat pump water, or there'll be about 10,000 heat pump water heaters replaced in our service territory every year or installed. And we want to ensure that we are able to help provide some level of support because the upfront cost for those is about $4,000 more than it is for replacing it with a regular gas water heater. So we see this as really an affordability issue that's upcoming, and we want to begin to prepare for it now and make sure that transition is, we can reduce as much pain and friction as possible. And then the third is local and emerging power supply technology. We want to have going forward into the future, ensure that we can continue to invest in local and emerging power supply. And so this is a fund. The idea here is that there are certain types of technology that are currently not cost competitive. And Chris, as part of the power portfolio, annual purchasing, always obviously makes wise and prudent business decisions. But as we move forward, there might be certain types of technology or local developments that bring more value, where we'd say, hey, we want to invest above market costs in these particular new technologies or local developments. And so this fund would set aside money just specifically for above market costs.
Can you give an example of one of those?
Sure, I can give a local example. So perhaps we would want to do, there's some CCAs that have, why am I just forgetting the yes, thank you, thank you, have feed-in tariffs, where they basically pay more for locally generated solar and batteries if it is on larger commercial projects. Usually those are large commercial projects buildings. So SVCE could do such a project, and this fund would pay for the above market cost. So what we would pay more than if we were just going to go buy
So that would
utility scale
provide an
solar.
incentive for local generation.
That's right. It would provide an incentive for local generation, and it would allow us to do that above our portfolio costs.
How about discount for other things like panel upgrade and other appliances in addition to heat pumps?
Yeah, so in our proposal here is to really focus on heat pumps because we see that's where the demand is going to be because of the new regulations that are coming down. Particularly, we actually are focusing particularly in the proposal on heat pump water heaters. The other reason for that is heat pump water heaters right now on average save customers money, so we feel really comfortable the idea of everybody installing a heat pump water heater, but we think that's where people are going to need the most support. And I should say our other programs would continue, right? So we've got our other program portfolio, that all of that work would continue to have, EV, where we do EV chargers, we do all sorts of other programs there. This is just an additional fund specifically for this incoming need that will impact all of our customers. Okay, so here I'm just going to go through each of these. I'll go through kind of quickly on the targets that we have set. So again, the goal is to build a fund that would ensure a solid rate discount even in bad years. And so our goal for the fund would be to set aside up to $75 million. $75 million is enough to cover our current target discount, which averages out to 5%. It's a 4% discount for all customers and an additional 1% that is spread as CareFera bill credits. So that comes to 5%. So $75 million is enough for 3 years of that discount. It's about $25 million per year. That middle column just gives some rough numbers to give you a sense of what the experience of our customers is for each % discount. So again, this is not a huge amount of savings, but it
60 cents.
60 cents for each 1% discount on average for the residential.
A little bit higher now with the higher rates, maybe closer to 80 cents, but small.
So it's $3 per.
Yeah.
And it's not easy to find on your bill.
Right.
They don't want to put it in, colored print or anything. It's
The low-income customers do the dollar bill credit, like this budget we're going to talk about. The bill credit could be as high as almost $17 a month. So that's significant, right? Because we don't have that many low-income customers. We're spreading that $100, so about 5.5 million or so.
How come that will be $17? Because it's 5%, right?
So we take 1%. That 1% discount is about 5.5 million. We spread it over something like 26,000 low-income customers to come up with a monthly bill credit. So their rate, and they get a substantial discount. They get that plus the 4%. Then they're also from the PG&E, which is actually a state mandated program, right? They get discounted rates on their transmission and distribution, which all customers pay. So when you combine all the discounts relative to an average residential customer, they get about a 44% discount. Their discount is substantial.
And how do we kind of define low-income customers? It seems like the percentage you came up with, at least by Mountain View's view, is really, really small.
Mm-hmm.
So FERA stands for Federal Energy
Family Electric?
Yeah, so these are defined by those guidelines. And the CARE CPUC has a very well-defined who qualifies depending on the number of people in a household and we go by those steps. It's the
So
value.
is there like a good correspondence between that and what we use for affordable housing?
So I think we're gonna
Yeah,
look into
we're
that
looking
more.
into, so if you recall, we had this affordability study session with the board in August, September timeframe. And one of the
That must
key
have been one of the ones I missed, because I missed a couple.
perhaps. Yeah, one of the key things that came out of that and that we were very upfront with the board about is that, defining affordability is very difficult. We can use some metrics like this CareFairer one or something that's out there, but it doesn't really mean a whole lot for communities like Silicon Valley where we have such a high cost of living. And so even though maybe we have a lot of customers who have our incomes are not below what the level is necessary, it doesn't mean that power is affordable for them in this area.
Yes.
Because of the cost of housing.
And then we send them to CSA or the equivalent.
Exactly. So we have a whole internal team that's working on affordability, including what other kind of metrics could we use to define affordability within our service territory? And then what types of programs and assistance should we be trying to provide to those customers in addition to what we're already doing? So we're hoping that by Q1 of next year, so early next year, we'll come back to the board with some more information about our outreach efforts, more about affordability, other programs that are available. Again, looking for your input as a board on what more we should be doing in that space.
Oh, that's great. And I know I missed some meetings because of the convention,
It was a very good study session. We can send you the information.
Yeah, if you could send
Yeah,
me,
we'll send you the link.
and tell me which meeting it is, and then I could look online and I don't.
Yeah, we'll send it to you directly.
That would be very
I'll
helpful.
send you the video.
Yeah.
And the care eligibility standard is 200% of the federal poverty guideline. So it's a pretty low number for California,
it
Bay
is.
Area.
And the other thing is a lot of the bills in our area that are really for low income people would be masked because they're paid for by their landlord. And they just include it as part of the rent. So it's really very complicated. Yeah, I know just as part of your investigation, our rent board is doing a big study on how this works in Mountain View and how it can be passed on or not passed on as part of the rent.
Okay.
So
We should probably connect with the rent board then. Maybe you can send us, I know Mountain View has a really high number of tenants, right, multifamily.
yeah, we have 65% of our population is multifamily, so it's huge. And we have 35,000 units that are covered by, I think it's 35,000. Anyway, units that are covered by the rent stabilization, so it's really a big, it's basically all the old apartments. All right, yeah, I can send you the staff.
Okay, so the next here is scalable support for pollution-free appliances. I talked about this some. So the idea here is to build a fund of scalable rebates and financing. We recognize as we move from, several hundred heat pump water heaters to over 10,000 heat pump water heaters, we want to provide for support for as many folks as possible, but recognize that financing might have to be part of the solution, not just rebates. But we also think that the first 3 years of any regulation are going to be the time when it's most important to have secure, steady rebate support available. And so we want to try to set aside enough funding for about 3 years worth. Our estimate is that would be about $90 million about $30 million a year after regulations go into effect. And the goal would be to create and design programs and support that would provide customers with the greatest need, the greatest support. So as an example, very low income, setting it up so maybe very low income customers had to pay very little upfront cost, and those who were able maybe also had little upfront cost but had more financing support. And the program and timing we would set to align with regulations that go into effect. So right now we're planning on something like 2027 back-mid rules, but understand those rules could go back, could be pushed back. Things always happen, right? Changes happen. And then I also just want to kind of reiterate, I think you both know this, but these BACMed rules, they are air quality rules, but they are really fundamental to meeting our decarbonization goals, right? We have to electrify all of those water heaters. And so we see supporting these rules as central to our mission. We're pretty sure that without enough financial support and other types of support, there won't be very high compliance. And so we think that support like this can ensure that the rules actually are effective and we see the real GHG reduction benefits that are possible without creating too much harm to people on the ground.
How does this program work for multifamily homes?
Yeah, so the rules are based on the type of appliance that are in effect. So let's just give an example of a 40-gallon water heater. Some large multifamily buildings, each unit has their own water heater that could be around 40 gallons or sometimes they might be 30 gallons. Some multifamily do have centralized systems, and those that have centralized systems, they would not be under the regulation until 2031. But for multifamily units that have individual small water heaters, they would be impacted starting as early as 2027.
So the way it would work is the discount is given to the landlord and hopefully the landlord will pass it on.
We would have to figure though exactly in the program design how that piece works. But yes, like in those instances, the landlord does buy the equipment.
Right.
And so there is a lot of work being done to ensure that those costs aren't kind of passed down to tenants. However, the best way to ensure that honestly is to make sure that the costs aren't exorbitant for landlords. And so then there's less likelihood that they'll try to skirt any rules to pass those costs down.
So it's about 90 million, so which means 30 million per year.
Mm-hmm.
And then you mentioned about 10,000 heat pumps per year. That's about 3,000 per heat pump. That's the math.
Mm-hmm.
Something like that, right? Okay.
That's about right.
And a heat pump costs about 7,000, doesn't it?
Yes, and so the incremental cost for a heat pump is like $3,500 to $4,500 for the basic change. So that 3,000 would cover close to the incremental cost. And we're thinking some of this would be, yeah.
Delta between the regular, okay.
Yeah, and exactly how we would come back to the board with a very detailed plan and options for exactly what that programming would look like. But
Yeah, we're gonna try and match the SVCE rebate for the next couple of years.
Hey, with your own funding?
Yes.
Wow,
Wow.
I need to move to Mountain.
No, you need to do it in Sunnyvale.
I need to move to Mountain View.
Will you be using general fund dollars for that? Is that something?
You know, I went to the meeting just last Thursday. I don't remember. It was
So this 10,000 is across SVCE coverage area, right? Which is 14 cities or so. So Mountain View.
Yeah, and we only have, I mean, the idea is that it would match it, but we only have a certain amount of money
Right,
devoted for it.
yeah.
I think it's like $4 million, and
That's a lot though.
that's a lot,
yeah.
so I don't really know the details, I'm
Okay,
sorry.
maybe we can follow up with city staff.
Yeah,
yeah, well, we were actually already in conversation.
Oh,
Yeah.
she already knew. I'm always surprised.
Yeah.
Advertising at the board meetings.
Yes.
Competition.
That's true. We will.
all right, I was trying to get the real info.
I'll ask
My
Larry.
homework.
Yeah, I'll ask Larry not to commit to anything.
Okay, and so the next is local and emerging power supply technology. So I mentioned this earlier on. This is to build a fund to invest any above market costs into local power supplies such as feed-in tariffs for solars and batteries, but also for other emerging power supply technology that might be down the road that could be local or could be elsewhere. The nature of anything that is emerging is that it's very difficult to come up with exact numbers But doing some investigation, our pro team looked and we think that a fund that was capped at around $100 million would provide the kind of flexibility to make investments. Again, all of that work would come back to the board. But could include local projects, demand flexibility projects, or other technologies. With the goal of long-term bringing costs down and helping to stabilize emissions. Okay, we've already had lots of discussion, asked questions, but this is where I officially pause. This summarizes the 3 targets. If you have any other questions or comments on the.
Per year cost will be 25 million plus 30 million plus 33 million, right? If all goes well. Is that the numbers we are looking at, or?
I didn't project it out for 5 years. We could, but we'll see the days cash on hand in the budget presentation. But let's say this year, if we were in the position, say let's direct 40 million. So then, yeah, it's always gonna get into the way it will fund through these. The next discussion item.
Yeah.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah,
I didn't
it's
get
okay,
that.
you're good, Tina. That's so then the next question is, if those are our key priorities, then how would you allocate the funding each year across those 3 areas? And so we drafted, yes, that's exactly right. We drafted 3 options here. The goal is to be flexible to the different target needs, but also simple so that it's transparent. So the first way you could do this is a strict waterfall where we said, hey, the first priority is just the discount. We're gonna put all of our money into the discount until we've hit that $75 million target. And appliances and power supply do not get funded until the discount is funded. Giving that $40 million example, that would get us to about 53% of the way to that target. You could also, you could put any one of these at the top, but another option would have a strict waterfall where the appliances were funded first. And that would put us about 44% of the way to the target with $40 million. Option C, which is staff's recommendation, would be to do a percent allocation where you provide some money to each of the different priorities in the first year and then continue to do that until a priority is fully funded, at which point the money would go to whichever priorities are not fully funded. Using that $40 million example would get us 21% of the way to the discount target, about 18% of the way to the appliance target, and about 8% of the way to the power supply target.
Can we bond for these?
Issue bonds for them? Well, if we just, I guess if rather than funding it strictly from excess funds that we have from operating costs, if we were on a path to fund these quick enough, we could try to issue bonds, but that was not enough. That's not something we considered here. The discussion was just what to do if we hit our target reserves.
So we feel like, you can't really get people to do it that quickly anyway, so.
Right. Yeah. This gives us kind of a 3 to 5 year runway to build these reserves.
Which is still, well, and also to get people to do it. Well, it's longer to get people to do it, right, isn't it?
Well, we think the big driver for adoption will be when regulations come down. That's when we'll move from a market of early adopters to more mainstream. If we have support, we also think having the support in place will be important for those rules to actually go into effect, or not go into effect, but to be really enforceable.
What do you mean by support?
I mean financing and rebate support.
What about contractual support? If contractors who can do it.
Yep.
The permitting.
Mm-hmm. Those things are all absolutely a piece of the puzzle, and they're things that we're working on through other programs. So the big gap that we've identified is ensuring that we have the scalable financial support
Right.
for people.
But we really need the whole system.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
We hear an awful lot about the problems of maternity, with getting the people's electricity upgraded and all that stuff that really puts a monkey wrench in then getting the final new appliance installed.
Yes, and we do have a permit modernization program that we're working with all of our cities on that includes some contractor training and building official training so that folks aren't unnecessarily upgrading their electric panels and needing to do extra PG&E work, which can really speed up the process and make it more affordable. And our analysis shows that nearly all homes can install heat pumps on a 100 amp panel. So we think a piece of that is really an education component so that folks aren't unnecessarily moving to those upgrades.
Yeah,
Also-
Yeah, yes.
Also, I would think previous slide. These could be, these are not hard numbers, right? For example, if the demand for pollution-free appliances go up this year, we can adjust that, right?
Yeah, I mean, we can bring it back to the board anytime and the board can change it. We can revisit priorities as often as we want.
This is really meant as a discussion option for you all to respond back to us too and see if these align with how you would prioritize the funding.
Yeah, just remember, if we don't adopt this or if we don't do something, then we're kind of in the status quo mode where the money just flows back to reserves. And if we hit that max target, then we're forced to come to you and say, have this discussion kind of on the spot about what to do with additional funds.
Yeah.
Yeah, this way we can plan ahead, right? Because some of these takes thought, build out, communications, marketing, the whole legwork. So rather than do it piecemeal each year like we have been doing, because we were not in the financial position we're now in. Now we can take a more strategic, longer term view. We're in a good position that we can do this.
Seems wise.
Yeah, it's prudent and then, it makes sense.
Does any of this qualify for that direct pay system the feds are setting up?
That was a little bit different, that,
Yeah, I believe you. Just sounded like it was.
I kind of like to think of this more kind of like your city budgets have a CIP budget.
Correct.
You have long-term
Exactly.
goals. And so you set aside money a little bit.
Capital
And you can-
budgets, yeah.
Oh, that's a good analogy, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so then the I think last slide I have here is an overview of what this process would look like. We mentioned this earlier, but the first step would be once we've had this discussion and heard from the board that we would draft a resolution and the board would adopt a resolution to establish this fund along with the threshold to determine funding level, availability, set aside priorities, targets, and allocations. And then as part of the budget process, if funds are available, the board would approve the annual transfer based on predetermined allocations. And then the staff, we would always come back to the board with kind of the detailed the detailed program proposals, for example, for any emerging or local power supply technologies, or as we began to develop these real scalable appliance rebate programs, we would come back for each of those. And the cap for the fund would be $265 million if it was approved as we've put this forward. And then I already mentioned this, but this fund is distinct from the programs fund. These are important long-term strategic objectives. They're not the only ones. Contracting is important, permitting is important, other appliances or other machines are also important and would continue to be worked through our overarching program work. And as we said several times, the board can always adopt changes at any time. The last slide on process, Anika.
Elliot's on his way. Yeah, we'll have a forum soon.
Oh, good.
So maybe we can do your discussion item, your fund, your rate stabilization item.
First, we'll open for a public comment.
Oh, sorry.
But there are no hands raised, there's no public comment.
Well, I think this is a great idea. I really like this, and like I said, I'm really concerned with, making sure we do this from a whole systems approach.
Yes.
Because otherwise, but if you don't get the funding organized, then everything else falls apart, so it's really important to do that. Thank you.
All right, so item 4, creating a rate stabilization fund using GSB 62.
Okay, so we will wait.
Oh, should we do the budget first
Yeah.
before this one?
You're asking the wrong person.
Is that you, Ginger?
Okay, only 49 minutes late.
It's okay.
Thanks. Whew.
We'll have Zoe catch you up on
I
the,
ran up the 3 flights of stairs.
Welcome.
I couldn't wait for that, no way.
All right, item 2 is the recommend approval of the fiscal year 2024-25 budget update.
Okay. That's an
Before that, do you want to approve the?
Yeah, we can do a consent calendar.
That's okay.
discussion.
We can share. I don't think I.
All right, so I believe we're moving on to the, we're going back to the consent calendar, which was the approve the minutes of the August 6, 2024 Finance and Administration Committee meeting. Any questions on that? No, I'll open public comment. No hands raised on public comment, closing public comment. Is there anyone who'd like to make a motion on that item?
Move approval?
Second.
Thank you.
Hold on.
You made the life easy.
you added value.
Now I'm in the meeting officially.
Great, and since everybody's here, we can just call the question. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Abstain? No, motion carries. Thank you. Okay, now, item 2, which is our budget update.
Okay, so I will walk the committee through the budget update. We did meet with the executive committee and they reviewed the same budget. And they unanimously recommended that the board adopt this updated budget. So I will go through the updates and then I will also ask you, the committee members, to vote at the end that they recommend that the board approve this updated budget. So the main items of discussion, the agenda items, is I will basically recap the budget that was adopted by the board in September. I'll tell you what has changed with this update, compare the two budgets. I'll go through the updated reserve projection. And item 4, I will now go back and talk about the logic for funding long-term strategic priorities so we just went through. And then I'll also talk about there's some additional uncertainty in the budget this time than we normally have at this time of the year. Going through those details. So this is our timeline for budget. As you see, we spend a lot of time on budget. It's big, important to our financials. We're in November. The board adopted the budget for this fiscal year, which started in October and ends in September 30th of 2025. The board adopted it in September, and we said at the time that there was a lot of uncertainties in the budget because we didn't know how the CPUC, what rate CPUC will adopt for January 2025, and we will have more certainty around this time of the year. So as we've been doing the past few years, around the December board meeting, we take an updated budget. So that's what we're reviewing today, and then we'll have a chance in March to do a full mid-year budget. And this time we were only adjusting the revenues and the power supply expenses and items related to that. So recap of the budget that was adopted in September. If you remember, when we presented the budget, we said we had used conservative assumptions in estimating revenues. A key component of revenue, as you know, the way we determine revenue, it's a function of what PG&E's generation rates will be and what the PCIA charges will be. We want to set rates so that we're competitive in the marketplace. And we said there was a lot of uncertainty in where the PCIA will come out and PG&E's rates will come out. And one of the key determinants of that is the market price benchmark, which the CPUC's energy division issues. And normally in October, they issue this update and we said, we can make an estimate as to what those updates will be, but we won't know until those prices are revealed in the fall update. And also at the time, we informed the board that the PG&E was out there heavily asking that the commission freeze the market price benchmarks for RA at the 2024 levels, artificially freeze it. And so that was an additional layer of uncertainty. But we said, based on the increases that we have seen in the marketplace for RA and RPS, and using the methodology that the CPUC uses, which is actually what the load-serving entities, they do a survey of what prices that load-serving entities have entered into for these products. Obviously, we don't know what load-serving entities have entered into, but we do know over the period that they look at what the prices we're trading at. So based on that, we did an estimate. We said if our estimate were to prevail, our revenues could actually increase by 145 million. So a big swing. Okay? And that budget also adopted a 4% customer discount for all customers and a 1% in dollar equivalent terms as a bill credit to our low-income Carefare customers. So that was the budget. What the update now does is updates for the market price benchmark that the CPUC's energy division has issued. And based on those updates, we are not forecasting a $145 million increase, but we're forecasting an $85 million increase from the adopted budget. The adopted budget here was showing that we would have a contribution to reserves of $14 million. So, this updates that number to something like $96.7 million. The key reason we didn't get the $145 million increase, or $60 million lower than we're estimating, is the component of the market price benchmark that came down actually has to do with the energy prices. Energy prices have been declining this year. RA and RPES prices are still strong and high. The energy prices have been coming down. Okay. So the next bullet actually shows that. We're projecting now to get to 96.7. And also in the budget, I'll show you in the next line item, we true up the transfers we do to programs, which is by board resolution, we direct 2% of our funds to programs each year. So now that we've updated our revenues, we trued it up for the 2% as well as the 1% low bill credits. The reserves, which I'll talk about for the first time this year, we're forecasting that we'll actually, on a forecast basis, we will exceed our reserve target with 350 days of cash on hand, going to 382 days of cash on hand, well below the 500. And then I'll talk about why there's more uncertainty in this year's budget when we get to that slide. Okay. And feel free to ask me questions as we're going along. You don't have to wait till the end. So here are two side-by-side comparisons of the adopted budget and the adjusted budget. You can see that the main line item is an $85 million increase in revenues. Power supply expenses, we always update power supply to correspond to the same assumptions that go into the energy prices and energy revenues. Those are slightly increasing by $3 million. So you may ask me, I just said energy prices are coming down. Why is our power supply increased slightly? The reason for that is actually the declines in energy prices is more than offset by the additional clean energy that we're buying that the board adopted at the last meeting. And also updates for portfolio positions, the timing of certain PPAs coming online, as well as high RPS and RA prices, as well as resulting the portfolio changing positions of those products. And then the other main item, the non-operating revenue increase there is just forecasting that now we'll have more income, so our return on investment or interest income basically goes up, and on our portfolio So and the 1.7 increase in program, again, is the true up for the 2% allocation, and the 959 million additional transfer for low-income customers towards their bill credit is again to true up the rate projections. So this is a busy slide, but this basically shows you that.
Yes, like, what is the building fund? Is that the new building? It's 00 there.
Oh, okay, I should have removed that. That was last year's budget item. We had set aside, if you last year, remember, we set aside
For new
20 million.
Right.
Yeah, we may have some updates on that. We're making progress, but we were investigating whether to buy a building or to lease and what economics makes sense for that. So
I thought you were buying a building in Sunnyvale.
we'll have more updates.
We have a lot to rent in Mountain View.
Okay, so this shows all the gyrations of what I just talked about on the revenue forecast. The first column there is basically looking at the blue box is basically the rate on average, our blended average rate that we charge our customers. That times our sales volume is our revenues. But what the customers pay is the blue box plus the orange box. They also pay the PCIA. And in 2024, PG&E had two sets of rate, first from January through June, and the other, then about 11% lower rate from July through December. That's a blended rate, so looking at an annual blended basis. And then I'll show you in the next slide how it compares to current rates that are in effect. The middle column shows what our assumptions were when we adopted the budget in September. And the estimated budget is, at the time when we adopted the budget, this is what we were showing that we could have a increase in revenues of 145 million if the RA and RPS benchmarks, market price benchmarks came at the levels we thought they could come in at. And then the last column is this updated budget, which shows, well, they didn't quite come in at the level that we were projecting. They came in lower. So we have a $60 million decline from the middle box, and an $85 million upswing from the updated budget. And for the board presentation, I would probably move this detail slide to the appendix, but I just wanted to go into a little more detail about the committee meeting.
Yeah, this is really good. There's a lot in this.
Yeah.
I always like this slide.
Okay, so this one, which I will keep at the board level, is basically showing on average, what does this mean for the rates that our customers are paying right now that's in effect. Again, that's the blue box plus the orange box is what our customers are paying right now. And if the rates that we're assuming in this budget forecast, if they were to prevail, and the PG&E's, what we're forecasting is PG&E's rates were adopted by the PUC, we're showing that on average, our customers' rates will actually slightly decrease by 2%. This is on average. Some customers may have a slight increase, some will have a slight decrease, but on average, we don't expect an increase in rates. So it's on an average, it's going to be about 2% lower. Okay, now we get to the fun part, the reserve projections. So
It's me.
I have good news and bad news. The good news is that when we put this projection group together, you can see that the next year we're forecasting to be 382. And right now I'm going to concentrate on the darker blue bars. Let me just tell you what the difference is. So the darker blue bars is basically takes into account the earmarked funds, the funds that we have for programs that are in play, but the customers haven't taken up that fund yet, or some of the programs that we are implementing right now. And then the 20 million, as we talked about, that we've set aside for the building fund. So that's about close to about $100 million or so at the beginning of this fiscal year. Right? So if we were to take that out, the darker blue boxes shows where our reserves are. And that's what we would go by with the reserve policy. So we can see based on our target of 350 days, which is the green bar, we're projecting we'll be exceeding for this fiscal year, and this graph shows that we'd be approaching 500. But since this forecast was put together, and I'll talk about it on the slides, some of the uncertainties we had some late developments in the CPUC's proceeding and PG&E's updating the grades. And as a result, some of the models that get updated were not updated in time. We just got it like literally last Thursday, we got an update. Wednesday or Thursday of last week, we got an updated model. So when we apply the updated model, we're still projecting 382 days for the current fiscal year. But these outer years are showing actually the reserves will start to dip. Towards the end of that 5-year period, it will go down to close to about 305 days as opposed to 474 days. But again, these are projections. They will go up and down with movements in energy prices. But the key thing is we are in a much better financial position than our startup phase when we're building up reserves to shore up our reserves so we can withstand some of the risks that we face in this business. But now we're in that position where, as we talked about in the previous discussion, that we can start thinking about setting aside fund for longer-term strategic priorities. So that's why we had that other discussion. So years in which we have good reserve, we will direct funding towards that. And that's what I've captured in this slide. And basically, what we're saying is that, we will look at it. I'm teeing it up as the next agenda item, but for us in this meeting, it became the first agenda item.
So this days cash on hand, if your expenses are increasing, how do you account for the expenses increasing year to year?
So it's in the reserve projections. We basically take into account what each year's burn rate is, looking at the reserve projections. So we do a 5-year budget forecast, which we went through the 5-year at the September. We did do a budget this year too. We're just not showing the 5-year, we're just showing the reserves summary. But we do a 5-year forecast of all the expenses. For energy, we do a detail based on market forward prices that we reserve where energy is trading at. And then the operating expenses, we simply escalate because we don't have that much detail. And the biggest expense is the energy supply expense anyway. It's more than 90% of our budget.
I remember you saying that operating expenses grows at a very, it's almost a flat line or something like that.
90% plus is our power supply expense in our budget. I think I have covered this slide, so I'll just go to the next one. So as we talked about in the previous discussion that Zoe went through, the way we plan to fund the ACC fund from the previous discussion is generally we will look at the forecast around December timeframe when we will have financials for the previous fiscal year. And we will generally base the decision on where the previous financial year ended, so we have certainty in the amount we're funding in this fund. But we may, in good years, where we have more certainty in the budget about the current fiscal year, we may ask the board to consider funding something addition to that. But we don't have to. And we can do this at the December update or the March update. But generally, we want to take a historical view and look at how the year has ended and base it on actual results. Because there's always so much uncertainty, forecast. Okay, so for this fiscal year, even though we talked about creating this fund, as I said, this is a longer-term view. At this time, we are not recommending any funding because there's a lot of uncertainty in this budget forecast, which I'll go into the next slide. But I said if some of these uncertainties are removed, we can certainly revisit this decision, media budget. But as these are longer-term strategic priorities and they take time to design and implement, it's not much is lost if we were to wait till next December. But again, if we are very solid projections in mid-year, we know what the CPC rates are implemented, how that's working out, we may direct some fund. Have the discussion in March. Okay, so now what is the additional uncertainty in this year's budget? So as I said, PG&E, if you remember, at the time of the budget adoption, we said PG&E was asking to freeze RA MPVs at last year's level. They haven't given up. They keep asking the CPUC, even though the the judge in this case said these arguments were out of scope. It could be considered in a new proceeding or a reopening of a PCIA proceeding. And just a few minutes before coming into this meeting, I learned that a proposed decision came out in this, and the judge is continuing to saying that these arguments are out of scope with this proceeding, but said they may consider it in a new proceeding or in a different proceeding. So it doesn't say PG&E's argument doesn't have merit, but say let's delay that. So good. And the 2025 rates that we're basing these projections on could be revisited on, and remember these are forecast basis that PG&E puts its rates and then they do a true up year later, right? Right now we're truing up for 2024. So these could be adjusted down on a true up basis, which would affect our finances in 2026. Nothing is baked, nothing is in the bank yet. There's still a lot of uncertainty out there. So again, we will see how this proceeds, but this is an uncertainty. Even though the judge in the proposed decision is saying that these are out of scope, they can still come back in scope because the CPUC can issue a decision that is that may be sympathetic to PG&E's arguments. They may want to mitigate rating impact for bundle customers, and there can be alternative proposed decisions that are proposed in this proceeding. We don't know. So the uncertainty still remains, even though it's more likely the judge's argument will prevail. That's what we think, because it's valid. We believe there are scope arguments, but we never know. So there's no need to rush to judgment right now in making decisions about funding that we don't need, that we can easily wait on. Also, the other thing that happened this year is we have some late developments. As I mentioned, normally the first set of market price came out in October 4th, as they're supposed to come out in October, but then the Energy Division made 2 subsequent adjustments, corrections to the market price benchmarks. The last coming up in November 5th. So that's why we don't have updated PG&E era information as the time we put this forecast together, and we didn't have the consultant update. As I said, we just received that late last week. And the final rates that the PUC will adopt will be in December 15, and there will be further updates that PG&E will make. When PG&E makes its error update, they basically true it up to a certain date. I believe that was up to September. So they will make probably additional updates for truing up their balancing accounts for October, November, probably. All of that will be incorporated, and then they will file an advice letter after the PUC decision in late December. That's when we'll first kind of know in early January what the rates will be. And that's so that's we have basically it's uncertain until that point. So what we're asking is at this point the board approve the budget update that we're projecting for new revenues. We're not asking for any additional funding. We're saying continue to fund the customer discount at 4% for all customers and 1% dollar bill credit for low-income customers, which we're projecting would be close to $17, about $16.94. The level of customers stay at the same level. And the way the rate changes will occur is once we have the final set of rates, the month in which PG&E's rates will become effective, which is expected to be January, we will basically need about 2 to 3 weeks to get the rates into our billing system. And that's when our new rates will be adopted. And after they are adopted, we'll bring those set of rates as we do every year back to the board. Let's review. At this point, any questions?
I was curious if, I keep hearing these fears of potential tariffs, and of course that pretty much affects everyone in the land. How would that affect us? I mean, obviously nothing's happened yet, but if big tariffs would occur, I'm assuming that would have a lot of effects in regards to energy, especially when it comes to like solar panels and, a lot of the actual physical items and things we need to, make the grid function, et cetera.
Yeah, so most of the PPAs that we have now, most of them are set. And
So, but some of them, on a couple of them, there's always development risk, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that if you haven't procured all your equipment as of yet, and you get subject to these tariffs, then that'll drive the cost of those
Sure.
projects up. And then, certainly our developers will let us know if that's the case. But for new contracts or for new resources that we have to procure, because if you remember, we have quite a bit of procurement that we have to do on an ongoing basis, we do expect that these tariffs will have an impact on prices. In fact, I think it's already kind of baked in because,
Oh, really?
we're starting to hear some rumbling about some changes that might be coming to the Inflation Reduction Act. It's all speculation, but one of them has to do with the amount of domestic content that'll be required to maintain the ITC, the investment tax credit and the production tax credit. And then, of course, the hinting about these tariffs that might happen or not happen. So,
Sure.
but I'd imagine that it might get a little tighter in terms of the suppliers and developers' ability to provide these resources. So that'll in turn increase costs, but not in the next fiscal year, right?
Okay.
So I think we're pretty set for the next couple of fiscal years in terms of our resources.
That's good.
But we're looking at really kind of longer term how this
Right.
impacts.
Okay.
A lot of uncertainty, that's for sure. That's why we carry so much days cash on
Is that
hand.
the number one word, I think, in this whole industry, I think? Sure.
No questions.
Opening for public comment. See no hands raised, closing public comment. Is an action item. Anyone would like to make a motion?
We need a motion, right? Yeah. You want to make a motion?
I move the staff recommendation.
I'll second it. I'll be a Mr. Second.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Abstained? That motion carries unanimously. Thank you.
So just doing a time check, acting chair, we have 45 minutes left and 2 items, including one of which is an action item.
Okay.
So, Amrit, is it okay if we maybe move, is it too late to move the agenda so that we have the action item first?
As long as it's okay with the committee.
I think we should, we can. I don't have any objection.
I'm fine with that. Sure.
Yes, that's a good idea.
All right, Mike, so then you're on next. Sorry, Amrit.
Fabulous.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all for being here. I'm here to talk today about the policy streamlining project that we've been busily working on. I'm joined by Demi on the line, who's been my partner on this and has made this all possible. So first off, next slide. There's a 2-slide recommendation for what we're asking you to do. It's a fair number of policies, as you may have seen in the staff report. Extensive. Apologies for how long it was.
You knew the amount of pages. I'm impressed.
Bravo, indeed. So I'm going to show you the full recommendation, but it is over 2 slides. And really what we're asking for is to adopt the set of policies on the far left and to retire the policies in the next 2 columns. And we'll talk a bit about this as we go, but effectively all the content that's in those policies that we're asking to retire have been moved into standards that are now not approved at the board level, but are approved at the CEO levels that sort of live underneath the policies. And we'll go a bit more into that, but this is the first slide, and then the second slide is there. So there's a couple more policies for adoption: general administrative policy, files and records, and then HR, personnel, reimbursement policy, and then a whole set being proposed to retire. So that's the recommendation. And if we go to the next slide, this gives a bit of an overview of the process we've gone through to get here. So we started last November out of one of the meetings of this committee to talk about policies and the need to update them. And there was conversation with the committee members and staff there that we should review all of our policies, try to streamline where we can, sort of make sure that they are what they need to be. And so we've really spent the last year doing that. We've looked at opportunities to update language where things have changed, either operationally or legally, reduce language wherever possible, eliminating redundancies in that same vein. And then really we've identified this new structure where we can move a lot of the sort of operational or sensitive details out of the policies, which today are very extensive, and move those into, again, standards. So the policies continue to be approved at the board level. They're sort of higher level, enable us to do things and provide, certain limitations. And then sort of how we do that moves into the CEO's hands, and they adopt standards that sort of, pencil out the steps a bit more. And then below that, we're also going to have procedures, which are also approved by the CEO and are kind of a step-by-step process for some of the activities that the agency does. So that is the new structure, and in this, we tried to keep sort of the key policy decisions at the board level. And then in terms of process, we met with the executive committee on Friday to talk about a very small handful of the policies. We're meeting with you all today to talk about sort of the lion's share of the policies. And we're looking for recommendations from both committees to make to the board of directors that will see all of the policies in December, is the plan for today. And then once the board adopts those policies, staff will move expeditiously to adopt standards that accompany those policies. And then in the near term, we'll do sort of a rollout process with staff and as well as board members on the policies that have changed that apply to them. And then in the longer term, we've set up sort of a regular schedule of reviewing each of the policies, as well as a regular cadence for training sort of select staff that the policy applies to. Next slide. This is just a sort of a very, very high level snapshot of like the sheer number of documents that we touched here. And so after the dust has settled in terms of the staff recommendations, we are proposing to retire 30 policies. We're creating a few new ones, and so total, if the board approves the staff's recommendations, we would end up with 21 policies at the board level. That's down from 48 when we started this project. We've developed new standards, so there'll be 30 of those, and we've updated the HR handbook. We've got, again, sort of the list of procedures and other things we're going to turn to once this chapter is complete, but that's where we're at today. Next slide. And so now I'm going to go through sort of each area of the policies and talk through some of the highlights about what we changed, and welcome any questions about any of this stuff as we go. So there were a number of changes to the finance policies. Some of the meatier changes, I think, in the policies happened here. A lot of the other policies were just kind of clean up, updating, maybe consolidating two policies into one. Here we've made some substantive changes in terms of the board's delegation of authority. And the number one there is sort of that major change. And I think, maybe lowercase m major, but currently the CEO's signing authority for a contract without having to bring it to the board is $100,000 spent per fiscal year. One of the things we're proposing to do here is to increase that to $250,000 of spend per fiscal year. And there's some information in the staff report that kind of talks about the why here, but ultimately we're trying to, akin to the rest of the policy work, streamline the operations of the agency. This means less items on the consent calendar, less items that need to kind of be held to a board meeting before they can go forward and go to execution. A little bit less risk of, we've agreed on terms and now we have to go through some process before we can all sign on. And maybe the other side has shifted a little bit before we get to the execution. So trying to tighten some things up in sort of the lower risk contract areas. We also did a survey of other CCAs to kind of see where we land if this is where we're at. And it's kind of the middle of the pack. There's other CCAs, there's one that has a $400,000 signing authority. Our sister CCAs, PCE, and I believe 3CE also have this $250K signing authority. So it would be in with our peers. And again, the idea there is to streamline the work to get through some of those contracts. The next is removing the ability to invest in fossil fuel investments from our investment policy. This is just to align with our mission. We weren't really in there before anyway, but wanted to make it clear that we shouldn't go there. So that's being changed. And then we're also proposing to increase the capitalization limits. This is like when you need to amortize assets, and previously they were at $1,000, which is just fairly low. And looking sort of in industry standards and what's recommended by sort of the government accountants, the $5,000 limit is.
I'm not familiar with what that means.
Yeah.
Yeah, so basically when we buy capital assets, biggest one would be our building purchase. Normally we don't have much capital assets, they're like computers. Should we expense them or should we capitalize them, which means in our financials, we depreciate them each year.
I get it. So the
So-
ones that aren't capitalized don't get depreciated.
Right, they're just an expense, they hit the bottom line right away. The others are getting by the depreciation schedule. So this is a standard, is actually recommended by government, there's a government board of financial advisors board. They actually recommended 5,000 and other CCAs are at 5,000. So this way we're not putting small items and capitalizing them. We're expensing them and we're putting our focus on bigger items.
Streamline the administrative burden, that's the main focus on that one. And then moving into some of the sort of other revisions that, didn't rise to our level of key. Clarifying that the F&A committee doesn't need to be 5 members, it kind of changes a bit based on the interest. And so not dictating that in the policy. Clarifying the capital projects and debt limit rules, we moved to standards. So those are again approved at the CEO level. Delegations of purchasing authority. So, Monica's signing authority, creating the ability for Monica to say, if I'm out, Amrit can sign at that same signing authority level, but that she would have that documented. Also including some solicitation requirements for our purchases. And we've done, we have solicitations, we run them, but just trying to be clear about sort of when you have to do that, what steps are required. The investment policy we migrated, there's a number of detailed sections there. Those have been moved into a standard to kind of, again, keep the policy at a high level, not including a lot of operational details. And in the delinquent accounts policy, clarifying that SVCE does not have the power of disconnection. There's nothing really material changing there, but just for public facing purposes. And then moving customer generation rates and chart of accounts policies into standards. The rates are still governed by the budget that the board sets, and that's in the budget policy. And so the rates effectively, we can keep as a standard without changing any of that. Any questions on this before I move on?
What is public facing? What is, readily available on the website and what isn't? Like,
Yeah, we're gonna revisit that. There's a handful of policies that are readily available on the website that should be customer confidentiality policy, all this sort of customer facing terms and conditions. But there's some other things on there that we wanna make sure aren't included. We don't want sensitive IT information on there and those type things. And really things that are intended to be public facing, we'd like to remove. But even regardless, it's here in this public meeting, people can see the policy. If they request, access to it, we give it to them. So
public records they could.
Exactly. So to the extent someone's looking at our delinquent accounts policy, we want to make sure that everybody knows that we don't have the power of disconnections.
Okay.
And then next slide shows just visually, and don't need to absorb a lot of this, but really just trying to show you sort of the after structure for the finance policies. And so those green boxes are policies. Previously, it was all policies. Now we've identified a number of blue box standards that live below those policies. And then the gray boxes down below are the retired finance policies. And you can see above, it's just the names for each of the codes. So just at a glance, how much we're retiring and then the new policies that you can see. Next slide. So yeah.
Capital project policy, which is retired, is now standard now.
Yes, exactly. Yes. And that's more about how we document capitalized projects as opposed to the threshold dollar amount. And next slide, thank you for that question. So the IT policies, IT and HR are kind of similar. We tried to distill all of the existing policies into one policy and move a lot of the content into standards. And so for IT, we have done that. We have developed this sort of new model IT policy that captures kind of everything we want to do in the IT space. And then we moved all of the sort of details about how we're going to do that stuff into standards. And in doing that, we transferred the language of the previous 15 IT policies into standards. So we're not losing sort of the important details, but we're no longer kind of broadcasting and bringing to the board meetings, how we set our passwords and a lot of the how we respond in an event to, to a data breach event. And so trying to avoid offering up information that lets folks exploit our vulnerabilities on the IT side. And so within that, we did a review to make sure that everything in the former policies were included in the new policies. And yeah, keeping operational level detail or the sensitive information in standards is the goal. And then with that, retiring the IT satisfaction policy that was sort of a straggler because we're sort of determining our own ways, not just a survey to understand and ensure satisfaction with IT systems. And then there's just a list of the policies that were migrated into standards. Next slide. And so this is, again, just that visual. You can see there's the one IT policy and then a number of standards, some of which are consolidated versions of the previous ones, and then a whole host of retired policies below. Next slide. So the general administrative policies, a lot of sort of cleanup here. One of the things that we've done is we've sort of made clear the rules for reimbursement for the board at the policy level, and then we've delegated to the CEO the ability to make additional rules for staff in a standard. Records retention policy was refreshed to really streamline the information and make it a little simpler to follow and implement. And that's a big part of what's happened in the general administrative policies that you all are looking at. There's a few others that went to the executive committee, and there was, again, largely kind of cleanup, not a lot of action in terms of big changes. Next slide. So you can see here we've retired a few policies, largely kept the policies and developed some standards where it seemed appropriate. Next slide. And then in human resources, sort of similar to IT, we've tried to consolidate all those policies into sort of one personnel and reimbursement policy. And then the remainder of it either lives in our handbook or in a separate standard. And the goal there is really to give us flexibility to update those things as the law changes or as sort of our operations change without having to bring stuff back to the board that's really sort of very operational. And there's not a lot of, big sort of policy decisions behind it. And so that is what's informing this new structure. And you can see, we've consolidated into a new policy. We've transferred the language of the former policies into standards, very similar to the IT approach. And in this new personnel policy, we've sort of consolidated it from existing authority that was sprinkled about in different places. So there was a resolution that gave the CEO personnel authority. We've just pulled the language from that into this new policy. There was some language in the budget policy which allowed the CEO to overhire and the listed positions so long as it's within the budget, and we pulled that language from the budget policy into this policy. And then, as I mentioned, the travel and reimbursements have been incorporated here as well. So that's really what this new personnel policy is. It's kind of a constellation of existing authority as opposed to new authority. And again, refresh the HR handbook to remain consistent with changes in law and how we work, particularly in the hybrid environment. And then a number of things moved to standards. Next slide. So here again, you can see the one sort of HR policy, then there's the handbook under it, which we're viewing as sort of a standard level document, and then a host of other standards, as well as the retired policies there at the bottom. Next slide. So that's ultimately what we're doing with the policies. There's a few other little changes if you look at the red lines, but we tried to tease out really the substantive ones. And so on Friday, we chatted with the executive committee about a handful of the policies. Today, we're talking with you all. If we get the recommendation for both committees, we'll bring that to the board in December, after which, as soon as we can, we'll be adopting standards that we've got very, very close to being done, largely. And then in the first quarter of next year, we'll be rolling out the changes to staff, training incoming board members, probably retraining some existing board members, and then moving into the sort of continuous improvement phase with regular reviews and trainings. Next slide. I think that may be it. Yeah. That's it. Any questions?
Actually, I do have a bunch of questions.
Yes.
I don't know how much time we have. What's the other thing? The other thing on the agenda?
We have
Rate stabilization.
Stabilization.
It's an accounting change. We can go through it fast.
Okay, well, anyway, in Mountain View, I don't know if you've read in the newspaper, we're having this big scandal related to our school district, where literally the superintendent has resigned, and the state auditor is making a audit of the school district's expenses. And there's just all sorts of stuff that's coming forward that really makes your hair curl. I mean, it's terrible. I mean, like hundreds of thousands of dollars of questionable expenses. And in a school board budget, that's a lot of money. They have a lot of. But anyway, one of the things, the takeaways for me as I look at this is this superintendent, and there were many, many red flags that their board completely ignored that I could go into for hours, but that's political, you don't want to hear that. But that said, I wonder if my city manager or somebody here was misappropriating funds, how on earth, as a board member, would we hear about it? I mean, some of these were contracts that he had for like meditation services over $100,000 worth. And some were, really big travel expenses where he went on vacations, the kind of things that, and they're not quite at the level that we've heard from Clarence Thomas, but they're in the same sort of vein. So when I look at that, when I think about as a board member, I don't have a clue how I would know about that. So I presume that what's built into this is checks and balance. So somebody looks over everybody else's expense. Like, I mean, who looks over your expense report? Who looks over your expense report? It's not just a straight. I mean, this is airing some dirty laundry here, but I just, I don't feel as a board member that I know how I would, besides making public records requests, how I would oversee this.
Yeah.
If I was suspicious. I'm not suspicious. But this guy was very suspicious for years. But anyway,
that's true. In fact, I was talking to our city manager. Exactly the same thing. What are the checks and balances? So when you're putting together policy documents, of course, that should be one of the things that's been built into them. And I was sort of reading through this, and I saw some that I thought there were, but I just was hoping you could maybe explain it to me.
Yeah, definitely. There's actually a couple great resources for this. In the staff report, there's a number of tables. One of them lists the controls for each of the policies, and it goes through and sort of breaks down sort of the multiple, it has to have to be approved by the CEO. Does, like for the wiring and ACH transfers, they all have to be approved by the CFO before they can go out. And so there's a whole list of controls that apply to each policy, and you can see those. And if there's places where you think, we can beef up or you'd like to see some more, I think we can definitely do that. One of the other things we're doing with all of the policies is we're including sort of a mandatory reporting requirement. If there's any violations, it gets reported sort of to the relevant committee. And so at least like for this, the finance administration, any of the policies you're looking at today, if there's violations of any of them, they would be reported to the CEO, the general counsel, but as well the committee. And so you'd hear about those violations at that level. And then, in your role as a board member, you have access to things, you can ask questions, the standards that are approved at the CEO level, you can see all of those. Expense reports, generally you can see those things. And so, if there's specific actions you'd like to take, beyond controls and policies, beyond sort of reporting obligations and the policies, always happy to have conversations and talk about ways to do that.
But the heart of the thing is that we are asking for you to delegate some level of authority to me and not have me.
That's completely appropriate.
And we do an annual audit of our financials, but it doesn't go down into the level. I don't know who's on the audit committee here.
I know Sergio is.
So it doesn't go down to the line item for each expense, right? It just verifies that what we say we have. Financial statements. But by all means, and I'm not suggesting this because I don't want to create more work for ourselves, the board can always direct an audit of our expenses too.
Well, for instance, I noticed when I read through that there was a per person monthly expense cap of 20,000, right?
For the purchasing cards, yeah.
Which is a lot.
But not everybody has a purchasing card, only certain
Well,
departments.
that's true, but still, that would have shown up in this case. That would have been something that, it would have been red flagged with that, because he went over that in certain instances.
Right, exactly.
So that I found, but I just, we do have as board members, we do have a fiduciary responsibility to the public that things are being, that things are being spent wisely.
Right.
And in this case, I'm really just, I'm struggling with how I would figure it out in my system. So that's the thing. I want to understand how I would figure it out.
So as the finance committee, at any point in time, you can direct an audit of our expenses, right? And we all know that.
All right. Well, I don't have any desire to do that. I just, it's something I may ask questions about from time to time, because I find it really, this situation in particular really troubling. And then, so then there were some other things that are much less troubling. So, like for instance, I was a little confused when I read about the smartphone stipend. Is that $50 a month or $50 a year?
It's monthly.
Okay, that makes more sense. Okay, when I first read it, I thought it said $50, and I was like, well, what good is that? And I thought, oh, well, it's a month. Okay, and then I wondered about, this isn't a retirement again. It says SVCE reserves the right to terminate employment for any reason or no reason during the leave of absence. Does this apply to parental leave?
That typically does not. I think that's maybe the unpaid leave. Is that
Okay,
that
okay.
section?
I was going to say that didn't.
Yeah, parental leave. There's additional.
That didn't seem right.
Exactly. Additional policies. I think that's in is that the unpaid leave?
Yeah, it's an HRP 04 unpaid. Yeah.
So that has likely moved to a standard.
Yeah, but even as a standard, it seems like we, well, particularly with paternal leave.
Right.
I don't think you can do that. I think that's illegal.
Yes.
Okay, all right, then tuition assistance. We only there's been grade inflation. We're only requiring people to get a C. Do we want to change that to a B?
For me, it was a B when I went to Stanford, but then I don't know what
I don't know. I wanted to, there's been a lot.
But that's also in the standards now too, right?
Yeah, I think that's also in the
And
standard.
that's a pass.
But how many people are even?
Not very many.
Not many,
Yeah.
yeah, so
Well,
it
it's
doesn't
silly,
matter.
it's silly, okay. Then along with these other screwy expenses that were used, can this package be used to purchase, well, not a bad reason, but for instance, the reimbursement, could somebody use this to buy a bike?
Like a bike for themselves,
Yeah, they wanted to,
like the regular reimbursement.
Fitness
the
reimbursement.
fitness reimbursement, could you use that?
Fitness you could use to buy a bike.
Good, okay. And I didn't know what, and then the HR handbook, added provision for unpaid time off for an adult literacy program? What would this be for?
This is a provision in the handbook that talks about staff that need support with literacy, and some of the pieces of it in the handbook relate to trying to maintain confidentiality of that staff member that they're participating in
All
that
right,
program.
that's fine.
These are all things that we have to provide.
I believe yes for this as well.
Okay, that's fine. And then this seems, maybe I'm reading this wrong, page 19 of 41, GAS 03, travel and meeting expense. Does this, if I read this correctly, it says that somebody has to pre-approve in-flight meals? That seems crazy.
Yeah, we're working on the standards, I should say that. There's a lot of stuff in the standards that are like, wow, do we really do this? But I think that the idea is that first we have to get the policies approved and then we'll work on the
Okay,
standards.
okay, well, anyway, I just think
Yeah.
that's
But
ridiculous.
no, we don't pre-approve.
Yeah, the goal is to pre-approve all travel,
Yeah,
and then in-flight meals would be an acceptable expense under
Yeah.
the limits.
and also baggage things and, all sorts of things that come up, yeah, all right. Well, I just wanted you to know I read it.
Love it.
Yeah.
The exact page count, come on.
Because I printed it out. Anyway, thank you very much. And also, I am very concerned about this, about this scandal issue. And if there is a way you can think of that I could get smarter in how to do this, maybe we could talk aside, because this whole scandal has really kind of these things that have come up sort of rocked my
I mean, the other thing, the finance, and I'm not suggesting this, but the finance committee can also direct me to have staff provide some kind of an expense report too.
Yeah.
So you could see how we're spending our money, and if you have any questions, you can raise them there. Or again, you could just do an audit. And you could ask me, I would have to go back to the board to get them to approve an audit, but if it was just simply an expense report, that's another way for you to see what we're spending our money on. So
Okay.
that's the purview of the finance committee.
The standard audit meeting is only once a year, am I correct?
Well, that's the that's to do an audit of the financials. You can suggest to the board, I guess we'd have to have it as a request to the board to direct me to do an audit of all of our expenses and all of our spending under the authority that's been granted to me.
Yeah, and this kind of thing is so important because it just blows the trust for that agency out of the water. And it's going to take years to rebuild that. And that's really a damage to our community. So that's why I'm so concerned about it. It's like, I want to make sure that we don't.
And just to be clear, I understand that, right? And I know that. And I know that there's a lot of trust there, but I also know that you can find information out about how we're spending.
That's good.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for helping me.
You can always investigate, and we try to draft the policies with capturing sort of the level of trust that we think exists with the board, right?
That is appropriate.
You can move those numbers, in lots of different directions, and we tried to sort of strike the balance with where we think we are today.
And I was involved when I worked for the water district in writing policies on various things. And so I know how difficult it is, but that, this scandal that's just come up in the last 2 months in Mountain View, it's just new to my experience.
Yeah.
And so I really, it's really caused me to think about, from a different point of view. And before, I always thought of it in terms of administrative efficiency and appropriateness, right? And that is what we should think about most of the time. But there's this other thing too. So,
Absolutely. Good to learn from as well.
This is what the policy and standards are, how far you can be agile and then not micromanage the administration versus policy. And then board of directors, our board itself is a part-time position with all the other stuff we are doing, right? And then micromanaging this organization, it may not be the right thing. And then, but at the same time, we, as Pat said, we need to have some controls and then at least some feedback mechanism so that we know there are checks and balances.
yeah.
Good flags.
And if you want to learn about the scandal, just, it's,
It seems like there's always one out there and that always
Yeah,
everything. for people.
exactly,
yeah.
exactly, all the time, right? So,
Well, any other questions or suggestions on this?
I just have a quick comment. It's not just this item, but also number 2. I just love reserves and efficiency. Those are 2 of my favorite things. So this is, I can see the efficiency, this is a very necessary thing. I'm glad we're doing it. So bravo that this was even thought of, because quite frankly, a lot of organizations would probably just leave all the policies there and let it remain just this big bundle of sticks and wait, what are we, this clearly I can see that this is much more efficient and I love that. And then of course, I always give compliments about the reserve. So this was a wonderful meeting and I guess we have one more item after this. But first we have to take action, am I right?
yeah, we have to take one quick thing on the IT, which is my favorite subject. Vehicle and charger use. Why? What is that in IT?
Yeah, so that's really, it's about the agency-owned vehicle we have, the Ford
Oh,
Lightning.
okay.
So it sort of
Okay.
dictates, you know, if you get into an accident, what things you need to have in the glove box.
Oh,
People need to be
okay.
trained, need
Okay,
to be
got it.
approved. And then EV chargers, we got a few on the property, so it's.
It was under IT, I was like, okay, what's the IT doing there?
Yes,
Now I
yes.
understood. But cybersecurity is conspicuously missing there.
Yeah, so we took a lot of the details. We don't want it to be public facing,
Right.
so that's gonna be in standards.
Yeah, I don't have any comments, and then we need to give motion.
I'll just open public comment quickly.
Yeah.
No hands raised, public comment is closed.
Elliot, you go first, make the
Oh,
motion.
yeah, let me make a motion, so this is item number 5 and go with the staff recommendations.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Abstained? None. Motion carries unanimously.
Great job.
Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie,
This is, the cleanup is.
And that was really like your first job when you started, right? I remember your goal was to work on you.
Yeah.
Big part of it.
Good job.
Thank you for the questions and comments.
Okay, so now we're gonna talk about accounting and GASB 62 and what that means. So again, this is, at this point, we wanna get your feedback, and if we agree, then we'll move forward in implementing this later. So this is about an accounting rule called GASB 62, Government Accounting Standards Board. And I'll go into details as to what this is. Other CCAs are using it. This only impacts financials, the way information is displayed on the financial statements. So remember, this is not about funding anything new. It's about how we account for things. So it will obviously impact the readers of the financial statement. I'll show you how it does that. And I'll talk about, in case there's any confusion between reserves and rate stabilization funds. And then we'll talk about what kind of criteria we would come up, that we would want in terms of how we direct funds into rate stabilization as well as direct funds out of rate stabilization. Okay, so what GASB 62 basically allows us to do is to defer revenues to a future period. So it doesn't, again, affect our financial, our actual economics.
Yeah.
This is about accounting. So this is we can take revenues and we can defer to a future period and recognize it in a future period. So it basically will impact the net financial statement. So if we were to defer some revenues, let's say this were in play for this year, we would basically reduce our revenues for this year, defer it into the rate stabilization fund, so it will have an impact of showing essentially lower net position for this year. And then the years in which we will recognize these revenues would obviously show an increase in net position. And we can do this for this fiscal year, provided that this policy will be approved by the board before the end of the fiscal year. Okay, so here's a brief overview of other CCAs that are using it. You can see there are a number of CCAs that have implemented rate stabilization fund using this accounting rule. And this is sort of took an illustration from marine clean energy. You can see how it will impact the financial statements. So looking at the statements on the left side, you can see in years 2024 and 2023, in those fiscal years, you can see rate stabilization reducing in revenues. So essentially, for 2024, the net position, instead of 443 million, it's 403 million because they took out 40 million and deferred it. Doesn't mean anything got spent, it's just an accounting mechanism. And then the statement of net position, like the balance sheet on the right, see it appears in the liability section as a deferred inflow of resources. Okay, so this is the accounting. this is how the accounting would work. And let's talk about the impact it would have on the readers of financial statement. So here I've listed three sort of entities that are sort of our readers of our financial statement. One is the general public. The pro side is if we were to defer this, remember at the budget presentation I said that we have something like $100 million in earmarked funds? And the way we're proposing it doesn't have to be linked to earmarked funds. The way we're proposing is that the amount we have in earmarked funds, we over time put it into a rate stabilization fund. So what the net position would effectively be lower by that amount. So right now our net position is, close to 400 some odd million, 80 million or so. It reflects that 100 million that we haven't spent, but if we were to put it into a rate stabilization fund, it would show that instead of, let's say, 480 million, it would show that it's 380 million. But it would recognize a liability on the balance sheet, deferred resources. The reason most agencies do this, most government entities do this, is to basically stabilize net income. So in periods where you're going to have a negative income, you would dip into this fund. But what we want to do is to use it for earmarked funds, so that at least there's a recognition when people look at our balance sheet that we have these funds that are committed, even though they are not spent yet. Because showing 480, people would say, "Oh, we got 480 million that's available there, right?" But with rate stabilization fund, at least we can say there's $100 million that we have earmarked for other uses. So that's the reason I'm recommending that we consider this accounting change.
So typically speaking, you said that it's usually used to stabilize net income, but the intention for us is to use it for, it's still on the books essentially, right? I'm just trying to understand how it's something we can pull from obviously at any time. It's there, it's on the books. I guess I'm a little bit confused on what it reads as exactly.
So I'll go into previous
Please.
slide. So you can see, so 2024 Marin, they took 40 million out, right? So revenues, they've reduced it by 40 million. So net position they reported for the year was 403 million. But in reality, they got the 40 million.
Yes.
Right. So to balance it out on the balance sheet, on the right statement on the right.
Yeah, maybe that's the part that I
like the balance sheet. You can see that they have a balance of 70 million that they have deferred over the years.
Where did that 70 come from? That's 30 plus 40 years,
Yeah,
right?
the 30 years that they had up until 2023.
And then
adding the
40,
24.
yeah.
Okay.
So that is the impact. So basically, if they were to have a negative year, remember 1 year we had negative financials because we were still providing 1% discount, and we knew if we had a rate stabilization fund, we could have dipped into it and showed a positive income. But that's not really the purpose that I want to use it. I want to reflect that we have earmarked funds that right now shows into our net position. I would want to defer those earmarked funds. That's the primary reason for me to consider this, that I'm proposing it.
So to me, it feels like it's kind of in its own way more reserves. Is that a simplified way of putting it, or?
It's not reserve, it's just essentially just the balance sheet. Instead of seeing 403 million at the bottom there, if they had not done it, you would be seeing 473 million.
Trying to put together my head right
Accounting
now.
is always confusing.
It's a reverse of what Enron was doing, right? Enron was recognizing the revenue ahead of.
In the private sector, this would be illegal. You cannot manipulate your balance sheet. But in government, it's allowed in agencies.
Who makes the laws?
It's called earmarking, right?
So again,
Maybe
I'm not
that's
doing
why
it
I'm coming straight from a business mindset. I'm like, wait, what? Okay, that actually, I
There's
think,
no-
answered my question.
There's no economics that are being changed.
I
The
see.
cash flow is cash flow.
Cash flow,
I see.
financial.
Okay.
Everything will be the
It's the
same
same,
thing.
this is just how you see it on the financial statement. The reason
Okay.
I'm proposing it is we've got so much earmarked funds that if a simple reader were to pick up our financial statements, they would say, I've got such a large net position,
Yeah,
but hey, I've got all these committed funds, right? If the customers, depending on how they utilize it, they start replacing their water heaters, they will
Right.
draw on those funds, and then we have set aside for them.
okay.
So that's basically what, it's important how our readers would take this.
Sure.
The fact that it reflects unspent funds, to me, it's a pro. The con is that they may see it as a liability when in effect, like previous discussion, if the board ever felt we needed to shore up our financials, they would say, hey, Zoe, stop the water heaters. We need the funds to basically keep the agency afloat, right? The board always the ability to redirect funds that are not spent yet. That's to the board and say, redirect back those funds. So that's a con, but the overall, we think this is a positive assessment because we can always add a footnote that revenues can be recognized from the rate stabilization fund. Credit rating agencies, other CCAs that are doing it, they understand this accounting rule. They know that this isn't affecting our liquidity. So we don't see it as a negative impact. If anything, there was a slight positive that the board is committed to setting aside funds to promote rate stability. And our counterparties and other financial suppliers, they may also see it as a positive that at least our financial statements will be more stable, right? In years when we were to go negative, we would dip into these stabilization funds.
How many years have SVCE gone negative in your
The one in my watch that I think that might be the only year.
It was the COVID thing or?
It wasn't it was actually during the COVID period. Yeah, I think fiscal year 2021, PCIA was very high. Very high, like 4 cents, something like that. So again, to question that Elliot you asked, reserves and rates, there again, you gotta think of the reserves is actual financials. This is a non-GAAP, non-accounting associated. GAAP meaning generally accepted accounting principles that GASB sets for government entities. And we have a process in which how we establish reserves. You know, the financial liquidity we want, we go through a risk assessment. We recommend based on that risk assessment, when we set the budget, what the reserve should be. Rate stabilization, as I said, is GAAP. It's just accounting. You know, it's just the display of information on our financials. And the potential criteria that I'm thinking of proposing is at the end of the fiscal year, we would work with our accountant. We would, in order to do this, we would need a board resolution or a board policy. Then we can implement this accounting rule. The governing body has to set a policy for this, for GASB, to implement GASB 62. We would want flexibility. We would work with our accountant at the end of the year. If we would want to make sure that the deferred reserves do not exceed earmarked funds. Again, as I said, we want to do it for the purpose of recognizing our earmarked funds. And we would do so and direct it to a rate stabilization fund if our net position doesn't fall below 2% of revenues. If revenues are around 500 million, this is about 10 million. Because I don't want to create a negative financial because we're directing funds to a rate stabilization fund. Because there will be some readers who may not like a negative number on a net position, even though technically we may not be negative, right? So we're saying, let's not go negative. Let's use 2% of the revenues. And then when we would draw funds from the reserve is if we would fall below 2% of the revenues. So that, again, we can show a positive net position on the financials. Not affecting the economics, the cash flow, just the accounting and the way the financial statements look like. So at this point, this is just a proposal. We'd love to hear from the committee, and the next steps would be to receive your feedback. Then we would work with our accountant, as he has done, same accountant many other CCAs use. All the ones except for CPA use this accountant. We will work with him to draft this policy, and then we will seek this committee's recommendation again in 2025 when we meet. Our next meeting most likely will be in February 2025. And we then recommends the board approval. We will seek likely board approval in March 2025 when we take the mid-year budget for approval. That's all I had. So, any feedback on this accounting, which is always confusing? I find it confusing. But
Even you know.
there's a reason I'm not an accountant.
Get out of here.
We outsource our accounting.
You need a certain brain.
I just wonder, who do you think the audience is for these financial
That's
reports?
a good question.
I never look at them.
So the public,
Except.
so the public,
Not too often.
credit rating agencies, and the counterparties that we deal with.
Ah, the readers, it was even labeled. Well, I don't think there's many people in the public. Well, I could be wrong about that, but the credit rating agencies and the counterparties. So people that, for instance, we might be going into on a deal to fund a new power source or something like that, they would look at this kind of thing.
Yeah, when we enter into a PPA or any energy transactions,
Yeah,
there's always an unsecured line of credit we grant to counterparties and they grant to us. If we were to exceed that threshold, we have to post collateral or they have to post collateral. So they look at our financials as we look at their financials. And they look at our credit ratings. So that establishes a credit limit, sort of like a credit limit you have in your credit cards based on your credit score. You can think of all these, we create a credit score with our counterparties, they create a credit score for us. Financials affect that credit score. And based on that credit score, if we get a good credit, we don't have to post as much collateral, which affects our financial liquidity. So
so do we also look less sophisticated if we don't take, financially, if we don't take advantage of this accounting procedure that's available to us?
I don't think it's sophistication. It's more of, this is a provision that's there. Other CCAs are using it, and I've been debating whether it makes sense for us to use it. I don't see any economic benefit. But then our earmark funds are growing. Right now it's 100 million. We talked about creating a CCA, Affordable Clean Community Fund. That's going to direct more funds. So if our future financials look like, I could have a huge net position without showing that these funds are committed to something. This is at least one way. If I limit it to earmark funds, there's one way of showing. If someone were to ask, hey, what is these deferred resources for in your financials? I can say, oh, I've got these are directed towards. That's what I was thinking.
Thank you.
The financial statements are available to the board every month. Treasurer financial statement.
I shouldn't say I don't look at them, I always look at it.
Yeah,
Is it balanced?
we have
That's
the monthly
but I don't,
close.
The details, all
the
the
details,
fine print.
yeah.
Yeah, and at the end of the year, we do an audit of financial statements, financial audit. So that's going on right now for the fiscal year that closed September 30th, 24, which we will bring to the audit committee in February and which we will bring to the board in March, for the board to receive the results of the financial audit. Any feedback? You think this is a good thing to pursue or?
Honestly, I think if you think it's good, it's
Yeah,
probably good.
exactly.
Honestly,
Yeah,
I'm just being hunted right now.
Yeah. No, that is
We will
exactly.
work with our accountant, we'll
Yeah.
put some more meat on the potential policy or board resolution.
This is just the discussion.
This is just a
so,
discussion,
yeah,
and
yeah.
we'll bring it back. And
Absolutely.
also wanted you to have this context of a growing fund, earmark funds, that's even gonna grow more. We hope it's gonna grow more with good financials. And the concern that maybe what's this net position for? So trying to balance all these things. Right, well, thank you.
We'll open public comment at this time. No hands raised for public comment. Public comment is closed.
I had a question, non-agenda. Should we circle back to Hong Wei, whether she wants to still be?
I think we have a process that we proposed to the executive committee last week, and then it'll go to the board in December, but maybe you can just give them a quick update.
Sure. So in January, we'll be making appointments for our chair, vice chair, and the executive committee. And then come February, we'll be making appointments for all of our remaining committees, including this one. So I'll be sending out written communication to board primary directors and as well as alternates to express their interest in joining the committees in January.
Should we reapply or?
Yeah, I will probably reach out to you to ask if you have interest in returning, and that way we can identify that in the staff report.
Yes, and I promise never to be late again.
The February meeting, the board will approve the committees for finance and audit in February. We will need to have a meeting very quickly in February because we'll review the media budget or potential stress risk analysis that we will.
Like first week February probably.
No, after the board
After the board
meeting,
meeting.
Oh,
second Wednesday
after.
of the board,
Okay.
towards the end of the month, we will.
So I'll put a hold pretty
Okay.
soon for you on February.
Okay.
Hold until you confirm. But this is one of the committees where we really appreciate continuity in its participants. So
Yeah.
we would hope that you
That
all
makes sense.
decide to continue.
Yeah.
And then we'll check with on the way. Although she's
don't
off
think
the
she-
council, right?
Yeah, I don't think she was reelected, so I don't think it's a
That's
factor.
right.
Yeah.
So we'll have to recruit someone else.
Yep.
Yeah.
Because it's gonna be up to 5 members going forward, right? If the policy gets changed, it doesn't have to be 5.
Up
It'll
to
be-
6.
Oh, up to 6,
Oh.
okay. All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
You all?
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow.